everyone. I'm so excited to moderate this discussion on how data will change recruiting and hiring. I am pleased to be joined by Benji Encz, founder of Ashby, Daniel Grayson, recruiting operations manager at Rippling, and McKenna Quint, founder of Quint Capital, who's been the head of people at companies like Meter, Plaid, and Cruise. Searchlight and Ashby are co-sponsoring today's webinar because of our mutual vision for data to play a bigger role in hiring. Ashby is a recruiting platform that enables high-growth companies to hire more efficiently by providing advanced analytics and automation. Searchlight's talent intelligence platform is powered by hard data that measures the soft skills that can make or break quality of hire. Today, we will dive into a few topics centered around 1, how we build the correct data set to evaluate the hiring process. 2, the workflow problem versus the data problem in recruiting. And 3, how to get executives to see recruiting as a strategic investment operation. Now, to kick us off, let's start with a lightning round. To everyone on this panel, what do you think is the greatest opportunity for data in hiring?
I'd be happy to go first to break the silence. But I think for us, what we see with our leading customers is a huge change in how data can improve the hiring process by creating a feedback loop. And there are like probably hundreds of dimensions. We're probably going to get into a lot of these today. But the value of reporting historically, I feel like used to be a little bit like covering your traces. Let's share some high-level metrics on what we did like last quarter or last year to the executive team. Now it's actually much more becoming using data to actually drive decisions, to address problems in real time. And I think that's really exciting.
I think that there's, recently, over the last several years, you see more data used to do projection work for headcount planning and understanding how many people you expect to hire and over what time frame, but not actually addressing questions of who are you hiring and how are you hiring. And so, if you're a tech startup or if you're any one of us working at the companies we work for, the human beings, the people that you bring into the firm are like the only real inputs that any of us have for the outputs of our product. And so quality and the who, I think starting to answer the question of what elements of conventional wisdom don't hold true around who you should be hiring, and using data to push back on historical practice, I think is a gigantic opportunity that exists.
I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to go first, so I apologize for that. But I think one of the single greatest opportunities is giving more power back to the talent, because historically data in recruiting has only gone to the company, and it's only been for the company's use, a very limited use case, which is certainly something we need to change. But if we get better at structuring the information that we get through the recruiting process better and turning it into data, it can empower candidates to know themselves and their strengths and their opportunities better, which just makes a better experience for them and a more empowered person going into the companies that they're going into.
Also important, what I'm hearing is this opportunity for data to create feedback loops for us to better understand who and why we're hiring, and honestly empowering talent. This common through thread in all of this is this idea that data can actually better humanize hiring, which I think gets lost, right? That actually at the end of the day, the opportunity to quantify things is to actually give more humanization into this process. So Benji, my next question is for you. You have had an interesting journey from director of engineering at PlanGrid to create a recruiting analytics company, Ashby. What sparked you to tackle recruiting analytics?
Yeah, so it's pretty common founding story where you had to pain point yourself for a very long time and then try to decide to solve the issue. But a quick background on myself. My background is pretty much all in software engineering. And then in my most recent role at PlanGrid, I joined as an IC engineer, relatively quickly became a manager. And then at that point, kind of a flip switched. And I realized that instead of doing work myself, I can hire people to do work. and that I can magnify the output of what I can accomplish significantly by just really focusing on hiring as the key activity. And I spend probably 80% of my time recruiting from there on in my last 2 years. And data, I mean, there are a lot of issues that we maybe can get into with like what happens when you spend so much time on recruiting as an individual, but also as a team. But a big part was I had very little visibility, and the whole team had very little visibility into basically what was functioning, what was efficient in the process, ranging from things like which platforms are we using, where are candidates coming from. We had some insights that we gathered that were really hard to get after a while, where we noticed that some platforms we were using produced a ton of on-site candidates, but almost none of them accepted our offers. So we tallied up the number of hours my team spent interviewing that were wasted. And so all these things were really hard to get to. They were not real time, and they were impacting the team performance because my team was like the biggest time to spend outside of actual work was spending on recruiting. And in a way that was like top of mind for like a year and a half. And after that, spent a lot of time researching, talking to prospective customers, and we did about 100 research interviews, and 100 times reporting came up as probably the biggest pain point for recruiting teams, recruiting leaders. So we felt there's something there to be addressed.
So I wonder if one of those 100 was talking with Daniel, because this is so relevant to what Daniel does at Rippling. He is literally building recruiting operations from the ground up. And Daniel, I'm curious, what has been the biggest obstacle or challenge in getting that in motion?
I think probably the biggest obstacle is like it feels so often like we're taking one step forward and 2 steps back. Because as we build out operations, as we figure out how to look at the data, we uncover things that we weren't necessarily expecting to uncover, or something we were expecting to uncover, but now we have evidence of it. And so, you know, there are instances where it's like, oh, cool, like here's a new report that we can run that helps answer some of these questions about like how long the candidates spend in flight. What's the benefit of decreasing the time spent in a stage early on versus decreasing the time spent in a stage later on, and learning that like, oh, we haven't been even collecting that data correctly in the first place because the tools that we've been using don't guardrail us against, like, I don't want to say bad behavior because it's not done with intent, right? Don't guardrail us into like good collection and behavior practices. And it's only when things become visible through the work that gets done in operations that you start noticing all of these things about your process that like probably should have been done differently, but like how would anyone have even known until you can see in front of you that like your underlying records are like all messed up. And I work with a team of really, really, really strong recruiters. And I am constantly amazed at the things that we've been doing all along that aren't allowing us to answer the questions until we have the data structures that allow us to see that that's the case in the first place.
Mm-hmm. McKenna, one thing I learned as we were brainstorming earlier is that you had to navigate around a bunch of complex data sets to uncover what's in the hiring process beyond the standard KPIs. So how did you go about building talent intelligence during your time at Cruise?
Yeah, so I feel like I read work rules and just endeavored to build like a mini pie lab. I really, really wanted my team at Cruise to have the ability to experiment and learn. And that's just oddly not something that many companies can and will support. So at Cruise, I was lucky enough to be able to hire an analytics team. I had 4 folks when we were around like 400 or so, which is pretty big. I had analysts, I had a neuroscientist, I had a software engineer. So a pretty kind of wide variety of skill sets on that team. And they helped us figure out when we were in our very, very high growth hiring years, how to do that better. So we went from around like 150 to almost 1,500 people in 2.5 years. We were hiring in incredibly competitive spaces for talent. And we had a rather high cost team who was like the human intelligence layer on all of the data. So we'd start off, you know, with a general report on the standard KPIs, funnel conversion rates, time to hire, all that fun stuff. We'd look at that across the general population, realize that's entirely useless. We'd create a bunch of different views, splicing by level, by geography where we're hiring, by role, by department, by hiring manager, by the manager's performance rating. Like we just tried to figure out all of the different views that were going to be helpful for us. At the end, we'd have these slide decks that were like 80 to 100 slides long that just showed our entire inquiry narrative of how we got from like one question to more questions. And that was just like for your standard in funnel KPIs. It took us a few years to even get to places where we were thinking about more nuanced metrics like awareness and consideration in candidates, or even like the holy grail of hiring, which is the quality of hire. So that was, I was lucky enough to work at a place where they would support and fund this, and they believed in the value of that inquiry, but that's just not a reality for pretty much any other companies, which makes me very, very excited to be on a call with the three of you who are building the tools, who can basically be this like really, really robust people analytics function and team that other companies just can't afford. It's a game changer.
I feel like, am I allowed to tag onto this? Or I think Kerry's gonna.
Yes,
But yeah, you touched on a point that is kind of really relevant to how we see Ashby being used as a product. So for context, what you described is kind of what the world looked like primarily like 2 years ago. If you had the luxury, you'd have an internal team. Oftentimes, if you have a true luxury, you have a data analyst on the people team, but most of the times you have a data analyst on like a central data team who will be loaned to you for a certain amount of time, who may not have insights into people and recruiting data. And the biggest change we've seen with customers adopting Ashby for reporting is that we give the tool expertise and the domain expertise to the same person, which changes really the way that data can be explored. So instead of having a long back and forth over multiple months of documents being produced and new requests being sent over to like a different team, we have like one person sitting there and they can go through a session of 2 to 3 hours and can really understand the data by slicing it, dicing it in real time. And I think that really changes the way you work with data if you have such a tool available. So that's been the most exciting thing I've seen so far.
What I'm also hearing is that a lot of times, if you don't have a tool like Ashby or any other software to help with that back and forth on questions you're answering, sometimes the reports that you produce, these 80 to 100-page reports, take so long to build that by the time you build it, it's outdated, right? So there's such a need for more real-time support and analytics. McKenna, you kind of already touched on this, where you were very fortunate to have such a robust people analytics team at Cruise, but that's not common with a lot of companies. Why don't more companies have a people analytics team?
Ooh, this is a great question. I originally thought the answer to this was that like the market forces just weren't there. I'm a pretty firm believer in like the external market for the business has to be such that it will be a strong enough forcing function for the business to say, okay, we really need to figure out how to do this better because we're just not winning candidates. But that just isn't true because it's been a candidates market for like, I don't know, maybe the last decade. So that answer is not right. I really think that it just comes down to it being a cost where the value of it isn't realized. And I think the reality is when you're a small company, I don't think you can justify the cost of having like a team the size that I did. I don't think that it's always in the company's best interest to be building it. And that's why, as I was thinking more about my own role and how I would sort of iterate on it over time, I realized that the best possible way to actually build the people analytics function was not to do it in-house, but to go out and like look for people like you are who are building it as a function like for all different companies.
I feel like interesting thing about why doesn't this exist in companies, I do think you're right in terms of it's a cost that is, and the impact is hard to measure. I do think that the external market has changed. Like it has been a candidate market, yes, for probably a decade, but it feels like it has accelerated very significantly in the last year and a half. And I think similar to like recruiting ops in some other fields, it's turned from like a budget problem to now there's a talent problem because there wasn't a budget for this talent 5 years ago. And so I feel like now people would want to hire some of this in-house, but there are actually not a lot of people that have people and analytics expertise. And I think it will change probably, but yeah.
There's like also a scale issue. Like, if you're going to have an analyst come in who works with data, like you need to have enough data for them to do work with it that's like actually useful and predictive. And so like you need to have a pretty high head count and a pretty large number of people who are coming into your company before you've got enough like reliability. I mean, like Rippling is almost 900 people now. A very, very significant percentage of that is R&D. But if you look at like the monthly count of how many people are coming in, like, the difference between a great month and a bad month is like 4 or 5 people in some cases, right? And so it's hard to do really deep analyst predictive work in that space until you have the scale. And then once a company like has reached a point where they have that scale, there's an intense and deep hunger really across the company for people who have those skills as a whole. And if you're worried about your company's bottom line and growth or whatever else, and you're like, where can I put this analyst resource? I don't know that like HR or people is the sexiest place to put that person when there's probably a need in revenue operations. There's probably a need in marketing operations. There's probably a need in business operations. And so there's a talent market, but I also think there's like a disconnect between how companies think foundationally about the role that people in recruiting can play in driving strategic initiatives at the company versus like the seat that sales or marketing has, in terms of driving company-wide strategy and how you execute. And so if you're like, okay, I got this strategic need for analysts, I have that strategic need across the company, I really should put them where the strategic need is greatest. I think the reality is like HR and people is probably not top on the list. And so if you have the limited talent market that Benji's talking about for people who can do this work, you're going to funnel them to the place of greatest and most urgent need. And that's just usually not recruiting.
Yeah. I would reject half of that statement.
Bring it on.
Only partially, but I think you're right. I think you're right that there are like a bunch of answers that only make sense at much, much bigger scale, but there are a lot of data points that make sense almost from the beginning, like similar to, when we started the company, we tracked sales data from day one and it was minuscule, and now it's still, it's bigger, but it's not massive amounts of data, but there's a lot there in terms of which customers close, which don't, and like very tactical data points. And I think the shift that we're seeing to the other point is like, it is becoming a strategic initiative for a lot of companies because hiring is the toughest thing. There was actually a report from OpenView that I read this morning that someone shared internally. It was like what keeps founders and CEOs up at night, and like hiring fast enough is, they showed the difference from like 2 years ago to now, and this is like by far the biggest piece, because with all the venture money available to companies, the main thing you're going to do is spend it on actually building a team, and that team needs to deliver on all the business goals. And so I think there's a much more of a spotlight super early on, like how are we tracking against our goals, right? And I think that is driving a lot of downstream changes. But
it's definitely changing. And I think the longer the candidates market goes on, and the more it feels like this will persist, like the more that culture change is going to happen. I mean, across orgs, where like the need to be able to do this work and to do it deeply is going to feel more and more and more intense.
Yeah, when Daniel, when you were talking about how when companies allocate like data analytics, and they'll most frequently allocate it to sales and marketing, I winced because I can't wait for companies to wake up to the fact that, ultimately it's people who drive business. And the sooner that they dedicate the resources to the people function, I think it's going to be the best for everyone. And in terms of the small data set problem, I think it really stands true because one of the most frequent requests that we get from our smaller customers is benchmarking.
Yeah.
Because they don't have as much internal data on their own talent. And so they're really hungry for benchmarks for the rest of the market. And I think that's actually where talent software can uniquely fit in and support them on that.
Well, I also I think Benji's point, in benchmarking, I mean, there is a need to start doing the work early, even before you have the scale, because like otherwise you get to the scale and you've acquired all this like design debt and knowledge debt that you weren't seeing this as you went, you didn't track it as the company grew, you're not learning about what's changing, and then you hit a point where you're like, oh my God, we need this, and there's this high level of urgency to build something out immediately that could have been getting built out in iterations as you went. And I think the benchmarking piece is a really good example of like how people can identify the need that they have, but getting the resources to dedicate to doing it internally has been traditionally very difficult. And hopefully it's something that changes.
Totally. We are seeing a shift where in the past, recruiting software has been primarily built to help with workflows, but now they're being built to solve data. But I'm curious, why is it that in the past it's been primarily a workflow problem, and how do we change it?
I feel like I also want to maybe add another qualifier to that one. I would somewhat agree, but I actually think the current generation of recruiting tools, I don't even know if they were that focused on workflows. Like even if you look at tools like Gem, they're relatively new, which help with like email automation outreach. And Ashby, by the way, does that too, just in case you're curious about our full suite of products. But I think my experience back when I was recruiting was like, this feels a lot like a database where I can put things in and I can store them and I can come back to look at them, but it is not doing a lot of work for me. It's not reminding me of things. And I think I agree that that was the more focus of the previous generation, but I think there's a lot to be done on recruiting productivity, similar to like there are tools coming out around sales productivity. So it's not a main topic for today, but I do think there's a lot of room for improvement about making that data more useful automatically, that you input into that system, and getting more rewards for tracking all these pieces of data. Something we are thinking about.
Yeah, I think the good news is there are new tools coming out as there's just like more focus on this and more of a need. But I think like the classic tool, the ATS, is definitely a workflow tool. It tells you at some point you have to do a thing. And this has been like the thing that has bothered me the most about all these tools. And you see the same thing on performance management tools. It's just, hey, do this thing at this time. And what they're basically asking is for you to exchange information at that time. A panelist writes feedback about a candidate at a certain time. A manager writes feedback about a report at a certain time, and they read it at another time. And that's a problem, but that's not the problem. It was like the easier problem to solve, and that's what makes me frustrated. The harder problem to solve, and the one that we need to solve, is like, how do we take that information and make it structured so that we can like understand the quality of it? So it's like, instead of saying, provide feedback on this candidate at this time, it's like, make sure that the information about what the candidate's actually doing and how you're actually evaluating that information, make sure that is right. That's the problem to be solved. It's the objective evaluation criteria that I think has been what we've been talking about for a long time, but there's been no science behind it, which has been very, very frustrating. And the cost of it's really high: false positives, false negatives in hiring, it's performance and engagement and retention issues internally. And so I think if we do a better job of defining what a job is, what the criteria for success are in a role in a company over time, and we get better understanding how to learn what we don't know and incorporating that into the model, I think that's where a lot of the real upside is. And I feel like the upside, which we talked about in the very beginning of this call, one of the other ones that I want to add is like the data portability. So much information during the recruiting process is just like stuck in the ATS and it doesn't go anywhere. And this is especially true for startups, where often like recruiting is the left hand that doesn't talk to HR the right hand. And there's so much rich information that you get from references from the interview process that like should go into how you place someone on a team, how you manage and develop them from day one. I keep thinking like the interview process is like their first feedback conversation that they could possibly have with the candidate, and it's just lost and you start over from like zero. So one of the other things I think is really exciting about kind of solving this data problem is that once you realize it's this data that's really valuable across the entire talent lifecycle, you start to port it over from recruiting to kind of the other areas of the business, which I think just, again, makes for a better talent experience and a more effective company.
Well, and closing the loop, McKenna, so that like you have these things that you collect on a scorecard that say, oh, I believe this candidate is good at time management. This candidate's good at ownership. This candidate's good at solving things fast, right? And so I want to hire them because these are the three attributes I think really matter to me. And then closing the loop and being able to say like, okay, well, was their performance in the role? Did that line up with what you actually measured or what you thought you measured? And even if they were good at the things that you thought they would be good at, were those the things that mattered to be good at the job? And so that, exactly, like that back and forth between what can recruiting feed to to HR and to the business about like, candidate touch points, the employee life cycle journey. And then on the flip side, like what can recruiting learn from being able to port data in from everything else that's being done in performance management and employee development?
For sure.
It seems like we need to reframe the hiring journey where it's not just hiring for start date, but it's hiring for anniversary date, and how hiring is very much a moment to invest in that person. And I think that matters all the more in this crazy candidates market, where I don't think companies should just compete on comp. Companies should compete on better positioning their role, their opportunity to a specific candidate. And you can only personalize your offer closing strategy and be competitive if you really invest on understanding the talent and getting that data up front. An employee journey really starts with that candidate journey.
Well, Kerry, I used to work in college admissions. And I did that work for a long time. And when you were recruiting students, if you're making a really intellectual argument about like, here's what we're good at, like people will just go to whatever the best ranked institution is, right? And so like the version of that exists in industry is like, where's my title going to be the best and where's my pay going to be the best? And if you want people to say, I'm going to join you without forcing you to pay higher than everybody else that I have available, you've got to give them a set of reasons to choose you that aren't grounded in like logistics and strictly intellectual reasons, and that are based in relationships and culture and values. And instead of things that like will say to somebody, I feel strongly enough about this that I will forego a 2% or 10% raise in order to be at this place instead of that. And it's really important that recruiting functions be able to do that work. And I think it's why even larger companies like Google and Facebook haven't figured out how to automate away the work of boots on the ground recruiters, is because that relationship does count. And yet operationalizing how you develop that relationship has proved to be really elusive for so many places.
I always see that recruiting is a balance between art and science. And while Ashby and Searchlight right now exist on improving the science in hiring, there will always be that art to it, right? There will always be that human to human interaction. That's what makes recruiting work. So speaking of recruiting and the investment in it, for the longest time, it's been seen as a cost center versus a strategic investment. And what do you think has to happen in an organization for that to change?
I have so many thoughts on this question. I mean, the first is reporting lines, right? Like there are a lot of places where the ultimate reporting line of recruiting is either the CFO or the chief legal officer, right? And both of those people do really important work, but their work is usually about like managing cost or managing risk. And so if your reporting structure for recruiting or for people as a whole is like into people whose chief and primary responsibility is cost and risk, right? Like you're never going to get past that as like the primary lens through which you understand people and recruiting work. And then I think there's another part of this that's like sits on the shoulders of recruiting, which is, my own belief, and maybe this is controversial, is that recruiting is usually pretty poor at speaking about the work of recruiting in terms that matter to the rest of the business. So, you can talk to a lot of recruiting leaders where when you ask like, what is your drop dead, gotta know it, metric, and it's time, something like time to hire, right? But like time to hire is not the metric that matters to the business. The metric that matters to the business is time to start. Did people start at the date at which the seat was open and available to start in? Time to hire is a really critical and really important metric for recruiting to understand the work of recruiting, but it's not the metric that helps recruiting understand the impact to the business. And so, one of the things that I think needs to change is that recruiting has to get better at like closing the loop, closing the gap between what matters to us in our own internal evaluation of our functions and the impact that work has on the actual business problem, which is to hire the best possible people into the seats that need it at the point in time at which those seats need to be filled. And so, I think the better recruiting gets at pushing that boulder up the hill, the easier it becomes to start asking for recruiting functions to report into a COO, for instance, instead of a CFO or CLO.
I have also. McKenna, are you unmuting or no? I'll go next then. So I'm a little bit with McKenna earlier in terms of talking kind of about market first, but I think a big shift that will just happen without anyone having to do anything about it is just a generational change, where startups growing up in this generation of companies, they are dealing with recruiting as their top level challenge, right? It was not the same environment 10 years ago, but now we sell a lot to founders, and they didn't think they start a company to just spend their time recruiting, but that's what they do for like the first year and a half, 2 years. And so I think that just changes the DNA of the company. It's much easier for a founder and a CEO to relate to that challenge if they went through it themselves. I think another part for companies that are older, a big part that has to happen is, I think, more on the organization and management side, is really understanding the impact that a certain type of talent can have on a company. A lot of places that I worked at, even really good places, I think still had a really hard time articulating the difference between someone who was a top performer and someone who was like an okay performer, and how that would impact the business. I think as we get better at that, really kind of highlighting which difference individual people can make in a company, then we also get better at valuing recruiting these people.
Yeah, I've always felt bad like shouldering the responsibility for why these things are still a cost center. I feel like whenever I go, talk to other recruiting and people leaders, and they talk about how the business needs more data, it's like the most frustrating thing for them to get. But as someone who doesn't come from HR, who moved into the world of people from the business, I'm like, no, I mean, the book, How to Measure Anything, is like, I believe in it. I do believe in it. I believe there are limits to how we should be using data, but I believe that we can and should strive to measure all the things. And like Daniel was saying, measuring the right things is just really important. I do feel like there's a bit of inertia in the industry to kind of move towards the metrics that the business really needs, because it's different, because it's harder, whatever it might be. So I do think that there is some responsibility that like we have to take as recruiting and people leaders to sort of shift the conversation towards like the right data, the data that the business will listen to and speak to. I do think there's also, a recognition from the business that probably needs to be had, that like organizational science is a really messy science, and kind of having both of us meet each other in the middle on it, I think would probably help sort of further the conversation away from this cost center and being a more strategic partner. I also, like when I put together my hiring plans for every founder I've worked with, I'm like, look, the way that you even build a people team or recruiting team is like different than the way that I think you're thinking about it. We all talk about metrics like people leader to existing employee. And I'm like, that makes absolutely no sense. Half of my team should be staffed on how the company is growing and the number of people that are going to be in the company 12 months from now, and the number of systems and programs I need to architect to be in place by the time they're there. That right there is like a shift in their thinking, where it's like, oh, you're a little bit more like R&D, or oh, you're a little bit less like some of the more efficiency driven G&A functions. It's like the difference between, accounting versus an FP&A team when you're going pre-IPO. There's just things like that to kind of analogies like that might be helpful for the business to kind of think about it differently could also be helpful.
And to come back to, sorry, Daniel, do you want to go? Or
no, please, Benji, please.
Okay. To come back to this cost center question, I think it's also interesting because recruiting is becoming a lot more expensive. And I think, the joke used to be like all VC money goes to like Google and Facebook for ads. I think now all VC money goes to external recruiters. If I look at our like profit and loss statement, like the money we spend on external recruiting is more than we send to AWS and other vendors. And so I think where tools and software come in will actually be helping keep that cost manageable. Like in an increasingly competitive market, it means we'll have to focus on making recruiting teams more productive and more efficient. I think data will be a big part of that. So I think over time, these investments in tools will just make sense from a business perspective and won't necessarily even need a mindset change. Yeah,
and I agree with that. And McKenna, I think like meeting halfway is a really good point. There's definitely like a cyclical loop that happens. I'm really lucky to work in a recruiting org that reports into our COO, and he just asks such different questions, right? And his questions then drive what we build and what we try to visualize and make surfaceable for him on the data perspective. And so there's definitely a relationship that unfolds between what the business is like asking and where those lines go, and what recruiting departments are then like expected to produce. And I think that, you know, the data piece gets really complicated. McKenna, you talked about like using data to increase humanization. And I think that that's really smart. And it's also one of the reasons that shifting recruiting and people functions generally into a more strategic space is probably really necessary and beneficial, because like the outcomes you're trying to achieve are often not quant outcomes. Like, you know, there's no, you know, if you're Slack, right, and you're trying to get people to send more Slack messages, there's a very clear bottom line KPI that you're trying to drive, which is how many Slack messages did someone send, right? But if you're talking about people outcomes, it's really unusual to have a people outcome that you can, where the KPI isn't a sort of messy proxy for the actual thing you're trying to do. And so there's need to be data informed, but not necessarily data driven in people and in recruiting. That requires more thought and more care around like what the trade-offs are, because like you can increase a conversion metric, you can increase, you know, your on-site to offer ratio pretty easily by just lowering the bar of the people you're willing to make the offer to, but that doesn't necessarily get you to where you need to go. And so one of the things I think is really exciting about what's happening around the data is it's making it easier to frame those trade-offs when you have access to what the impact of the trade-offs actually are.
I mean, there's that, you know, world famous business statement. It's, you know, you manage what you measure, right? And right now, all the KPIs for recruiting, if it's about time and speed, then you're going to manage time and speed, and you're going to try to cut out things and take shortcuts. But what's the cost of that? If you don't measure quality and you don't measure business outcomes, you can't manage for it. And, you know, I think the big push right now is to get recruiting bottoms up to ask to measure quality, and also for business leaders top down to also measure quality, so that we can start thinking more strategically about recruiting as a whole.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Of course.
So one of the things I find to be really interesting about the work that gets done in like people tech and the kinds of things that like you and Benji are working to build is you like have to do this really delicate balance of giving people what they're asking for, but also being able to visualize a future where they have things they didn't know they needed to ask for, and once they can see it, they want. And so I guess this, Benji and Kerry, both of you, like, what do you see as the opportunities that exist that people aren't asking about yet? And what are you building that will allow people in like seats like mine to think about my work differently as a function of being able to see it?
On my end, I see the biggest opportunity is this elusive like quality of hire metric, where I think not a lot of recruiting teams know to even ask to measure it because they think it can't be measured. And a lot of times it's very hard to measure it, and mostly it's because of data silos, where, you know, we talked a little bit about how recruiting, if you view it as only day one of an employee journey, all of a sudden it makes sense for data from recruiting to go into the rest of the employee lifecycle. But unfortunately, that's not the case, where today data is siloed, where most data in recruiting lives in the ATS, and then data in, you know, day one of employee lifecycle lives in the HRIS or whatever tool that L&D is using for onboarding. But what I see is that talent software and what we're building at Searchlight is a unique ability to break data silos from pre and post hire. And then finally, because we're looking at outcomes data post hire, we can make measuring quality of hire extremely easy. And by putting together a quality of hire dashboard and putting it in front of recruiting leaders, it opens up their minds to the opportunities of what measuring quality of hire can bring to their companies, when right now they don't even think it's possible.
Nice answer. Yeah, I think that whole area is a huge area of improvement. To answer your direct question, yes, like how do you build things that people are not asking for? I think we actually aren't building things that people are not asking for, but we're building things that very few people, but the right people are asking for, you know. They're like the early adopters, and I think we have some in our inner circle of like early customers, some people that we think represent the future of what talent teams will look like, but 99.9% of talent teams don't operate like that. So I think we actually do very little totally incredibly innovative work, but we try to figure out the right people to listen to. And if if recruiting changes the way it looks in these top companies, then I think we'll see a huge shift that will have a ton of implications in like how people teams and talent teams are built.
Benji,
over
what
the
are
next few
those
years.
people asking for?
What are those people asking for? I think really the things that would be asking off of other functions, which is build me an operating plan that we can track against. It's like, here's it starts with the business goals, right? It's like, we need these products built. We need these go-to-market teams to sell these products. We need whatever the business goals are, which are then translated into a hiring plan of sort, which then needs to be quantified and managed. I think that's not a way. That's kind of a side effect of really high growth companies, right? If you're going from like 100 to 500 people in a year or two, it takes a lot of measuring to make sure that you're on track, and it takes a lot of adjusting. And I think we're seeing more and more companies in that high growth camp, and I think that is the biggest change for me. Is like similar to like what you would ask of a marketing or sales leader. There are metrics and goals that are very quantifiable. And I think what Kerry is doing is probably even more on the bleeding edge, and also incredibly important. But what we're working on is kind of one layer before that, which is just making sure that we have the same caliber of leadership, functional leadership in people and recruiting as we have in other functions. Yeah, and they get a seat at the table at the executive table where they belong, because they're driving all these other downstream business functions.
I think
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say one tailwind that I've seen is just like, we now have had the generation, this like critical mass of the number of companies that have gone through hyperscale, where all of those employees who were with those companies, whether it's a Square or a Stripe or a Google or a Facebook, they're now part of the earliest stage of the next generation of startups. And so I feel like once people have gone through this hyperscale and they realize, like, as a founder, your job is recruiting, as a hiring manager, your job is recruiting, as an employee, you end up doing at least 3 to 4 interviews a day, right? People realize that, my job as an early employee of a company that's scaling really fast, or not even early employee, just an employee of a company that's scaling fast, like my job is recruiting. There's so much more interest and appetite, I think, for change. So even though I feel like both of these products are on the bleeding edge, and yes, I'm sorry, you're starting movements, not companies, which is harder. I do feel like I'm definitely seeing some more appetite for these types of tools. I'm starting to see companies hire people more early, people leaders earlier on, which I think are all like indicators that, some of these tools will be very impactful in the near future.
Yeah, Daniel and McKenna, I think we're talking about how it's always easier to architect something right from the ground floor than it is to change something later on. So I do get really excited when I, talk to customers of mine. 12 people have a head of people. I think Meter right now, you're at 30 people, already brought McKenna in as a people leader. So I think times are changing, and there's no better time than now to be in this space. So really glad to be in it with such forward-thinking people like yourselves. Looking at the time, I have a last question for you all, which is, if there was one thing you would want to leave our audience with today, what would it be?
Lean in as people leaders to data. Don't run away from it. Don't think because it's data that it's bad for people. It's not. It has the power to build a much, much better candidate experience, a better employee experience, a more efficient talent market. It unlocks so many opportunities. Please don't be afraid of data. Lean into it. And buy Searchlight, Ashby, and Rippling.
I'm struggling to come up with one thing, but it probably depends on the audience. But for newer companies, I think, taking recruiting very, very seriously early on will just be extremely important. I think a lot of companies have learned that, but companies that have not will probably be in a land of hurt pretty soon. So kind of really thinking about building out the capability in-house, having the entire team think about recruiting early on and building the right foundation, as you mentioned, I think is key.
For me, it's we're in the process of doing a lot of like recruiting for recruiting right now. So if anybody's listening and they want to join my really incredible, very strong, very smart, and I have to say exceptionally good looking team, find me on LinkedIn and send a message. But one of the consequences of like working at a company that's scaling in the way that we are, where like recruiting is the bottleneck for company growth in a lot of ways, and in a market where it's so hard to find and hire recruiters, is there is an opportunity. There's like a window now where we in recruiting can ask really powerful questions about like, how can we do this work better, that in ways that don't just involve like throwing more bodies at the problem. And what happens when you start to borrow McKenna's, like lean in to that opportunity into the data, is you uncover all these other things. You start to uncover these like small opportunities that lead to big opportunities as you start, as we at least have started to dig around those kinds of questions. And so it's a really painful moment to be trying to grow as a recruiting team, but like that pain also represents a real deep opportunity to think about like how we can do our work.
Well, never waste a good, never let a crisis go to waste is what I think.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Has said, and that's maybe a good place to leave off. So Daniel, Benji, and McKenna, thank you for taking the time to be a part of this discussion. And to everyone watching, please feel free to reach out to us directly on LinkedIn if there are any further things you would like for us to discuss. I would like any excuse to get these people back in the same room together again. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.